Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. We had a very dramatic countdown. How's it going? My name is Chloe Tetro. I'm the health coach here with Ready Care. And for this lovely Thursday morning, we are going to be looking at mindful eating, what it is, what's involved in it, and a little bit of the relationship between the actual eating aspect and the mind psychology well-being aspect. So with regards, psychology of mindful eating. Also, guys, if you have questions at any point at all during this, just pop them into the old comment section and I'll address them as best as I can. Righto. So the relationship that we have with food, it's deeper than just fuel for most people. There's a lot of psychological underpinning with it. One experiment that I'd like to mention this morning that'll kind of prime us for what's involved with the mindful eating aspect is an experiment conducted by Dr. Brian Wansink. It's called the chocolate experiment, and some of you might have heard of it. Participants that were doing this experiment also have a cold, so if I'm a little bit more bunged up and lower decibel sounding than usual, that's what's happening there. Participants on this particular experiment, anyway, they were enrolled, and they were thinking that they were going on to an experiment looking for just your run-of-the-mill taste test with chocolates. So those that were instructed to really immerse themselves in the experience and focused on the kind of sensory elements, things like how did they feel, how was the mouth texture for them, what did it remind them of. So you can see there's an awful lot of different associative pathways being used there, and that's kind of like the crux of something mindful. So the guys that actually were told to really, really sink into the experience of it, to be mindful about it, to even think about how their bodies and emotions and thoughts felt, their satisfaction levels at the end of the experiment went up, as opposed to the counterparts that were just asked to taste the chocolate. So what's important about this? So the chocolate experiment, can show us that the idea of when we commit to the act of eating mindfully, that the food we're having isn't just satiating or kind of hunger or something we want right away, but it can resonate on a much, much deeper level. It amplifies our endorphins. It amplifies our experience and pleasure that we derive from a particular act of eating. So if we think of it in terms of, something like a dance, let's say, I'm using analogy to contextualize it a little bit here. You have the setting, you have the state of mind associated. So when you think of it in terms of a dance, you have the choreographed steps, and they can be our habits, shaped over years and through, different influences that we have. There's rhythm, which can be our internal sensations, our hunger or fullness. When there's any kind of discordance, when there's something out of step, for want of a better word. Now, I could be going way offside here with my analogy, so apologies if I'm losing some people with it. But when there is a discordance between our rhythm, that's our eating habits, where we place those things during the day, our choreography, that could be things like unconscious snacking. It can jar the interior, or it can jar our whole experience of eating. So it can bring on things like discomfort, guilt, regret. There's an awful lot of feedback that I get from clients initially, especially at the start of their kind of changing their habit journey, let's say, that their own relationship with food, they've kind of highlighted, has been dissatisfactory throughout the years, or they have a tendency to mindlessly eat, is one that I hear an awful lot. So what is the opposite of mindless eating? Mindful eating, essentially, is kind of what I'm getting at. For those of you that aren't entirely sure what mindful means, and I know it's a word that gets absolutely flown around, bandied around to beat the band. What I would suggest, if you're not too sure of where to start with this, is try to engage when you're doing something. Now, mindfulness, you can kind of think of yourself like arming out, eyes closed, sitting back, lotus position. You don't have to do that whatsoever when it comes to mindfulness. Mindfulness, right? Try to get as much of your mind open to an experience. It's not about analyzing, it's not about getting the mental chatter up. Basically, what you're doing is you're trying to be in as receptive a state as possible. When you're doing it with something like eating, practice the exercise of just going somewhere quiet. Try not to eat in front of a TV or in front of your phone for this exact particular reason. Try to get to a place where it's relatively quiet and you get to absolutely experience what it feels like to chew, what it feels like flavor wise, what it feels like scent wise, texture wise. Get as much of yourself into a receptive mode where you're kind of going, okay, I'm kind of getting this texture, that taste, XYZ. That could sound very, very basic to some people. They go, Chloe, obviously I'm going to taste my food when I eat it. But you'd actually be surprised. You'd be surprised. I'm guilty of it myself when I'm kind of in a rush and I go, shovel mode. That we don't actually engage an awful lot of our senses when we're eating. Now, I'll get into that, or I'll get into why that's particularly important when we look at the intersection of food science and neuroscience and cultivating habits. But just as a primer for the rest of the talk, when I'm talking about mindful eating, that's essentially what I'm doing. I'm not talking about finding a coastal beach that you bring your office lunch to and go, "Ah." If you've access to that, absolutely brilliant. But if you don't, it's just about taking a minute and reflecting inwards and trying to get as much of your senses on as possible. So the intersection of food science and neuroscience, what's important about that? So when we look at food science and the kind of very complex tapestry that's involved in it, we get some insights about the instrumental roles that their brains play in governing our eating choices. Um, and as I'm talking about this particular section, try to think of specific examples in your own life, in your own meals, where this might where this might resonate with you. One particular experiment that I'll mention for today is the bliss point experiment. And the research would show the length at which the food industry goes to employ specialized food scientists to craft, to actually curate products with an ideal balance of sweetness, saltiness, and fattiness, with the purpose of it being hitting a neurological sweet spot or salty spot or fat spot that makes their particular products that they're selling really, really irresistible and driving to us. Something that, like I mentioned endorphins a while ago, when we really get our pleasure sensations hit, it releases endorphins and we absolutely bliss out, for want of a better word, for that amount of time. What that does, though, is subconsciously, because you're associating those really finely tuned, crafted foods where loads of money has gone into making this perfect, for want of a better word, um, neuro bliss spot food that may not potentially be good for you, and oftentimes absolutely isn't. Can I just say, spoiler alert, they're usually not very good for you. That can subconsciously lead us towards overconsumption of that food. So not only is the food hitting the sweet spot in terms of our physiological sense, but we associate that food with, jeepers, I felt absolutely brilliant that day. I had a great time, or oh, I was so relaxed. And I'll find that an awful lot of the feedback that I get from people with regards to that kind of skewed relationship with food is oftentimes there's a crossover between wanting to feel good and going towards specific foods that elicit that kind of neurological endorphin hit, that it's no longer just a case of I like the taste of it. It's more of that kind of like, I've experienced it, and it literally is like kind of, whew, cheapers, weight lifted off the shoulders. But to remember that these particular products are oftentimes not good for you. They're not good for the body, and they're counter engineered to bypass the fact that they're not particularly good for you by solving a very particular neurological equation that hits our bliss spot of salty, fatty, sweet. Um, when we looked at the depth of a relationship with food, there oftentimes does need to be a bit of a paradigm shifted. So instead of just viewing it as like a commercial product that's kind of vying for our palate's approval, having a look at the actual net worth, the net worth of what it is that we're putting in, what is actually going to break down into the vital fuel, and what has the highest balancing sheet of that net worth. My my money lingo is like totally off, so I'm giving the game away here for myself. If we think of the brain as like this really sophisticated car engine, I'll remove myself from the computer analogy because those of you in IT will go, Chloe, please stop talking. So I'm about to show my lack of car knowledge. So the efficiency and the resiliency and longevity are directly proportional to the quality of the fuel that's put into the engine. Um, if it's substandard fuel, and it operates with diminished performance, it does become susceptible to breakdown, and not immediate. So that's the beauty about the human body, and what can be quite confusing for some people. For some time, is they'll say, "Well, I've been eating this way for years, and it's never caused me trouble till now." And what I'd say there is, it's never caused you trouble that you're aware of at the compounded amount that you now have up until now. Specifically, when we look at type 2 diabetes, that is it's not a sudden onset. In very, very, very rare occasions, if there's a shock or something like that to the system, it can cause something like that. But oftentimes, it's a kind of tiptoe. It's something that happens over years, decades, and accrues in the system, where the system has basically been trying its hardest to compensate, and eventually begins to break down. But it takes an awful long time. So it's essentially like running on fumes, which you can do for a while, but after a while you'll be down the highway with the car going gadung 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 gadung, wondering what's going wrong. So building on the idea that, for those of you that might have heard of the brain gut axis, so that's something that, thankfully, we've heard an awful lot more in kind of popular culture, newspapers, radio, etc. So the brain gut axis is a bidirectional, as in it goes two ways. It doesn't just go from one way, it goes both sides. And it's a kind of communication highway that links our cognitive function with gastrointestinal tract, which I'm kind of thinking, like 20 years ago, that might have seemed quite bonkers, but very much our body operates in a kind of systemic, like we often can kind of compartmentalize things, and if I'm using the car analogy again, having a very good, oh God, I don't know anything about cars. Having particular parts of your car run really, really well is brilliant, but unless they can communicate to one another, and that communication is running smoothly, you're going to find that eventually things can break down, and you kind of go, well, jeepers, my engine's in great nick, but you go, yeah, but your tires are in bits, the car's not going to run. Similarly, with the systems of the body, we can, just focus on our cognitive function and just focus on our gut, but we'll always be missing part of the puzzle if we don't take into account that communication highway, that thing that links them together. So it's not just a conduit for hunger or fullness. The brain gut axis would play a pivotal role in modulating our moods, and that's a massive one. Our moods, our cognitive function, our stress responses, mindful eating. It's not just about nourishing the body, but it's also about supporting this neural connection. When we make good food choices, we directly influence the axis, and we can promote mental well-being and cognitive sharpness. There's a book, excuse me, by Michael Moss called Salt, Sugar, Fat that looks at that and the kind of the relationship between food companies manipulating the neurological inclinations. So for those that are interested in that, it's called Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss, and looks at the urgency in creating a more mindful approach towards what we eat. I'd also say in the probiotic field, really messy field full of bacteria. in the probiotic field, that's become quite, thankfully, it's kind of blown up. There's it's a UCC trialed probiotic. So probiotic that was patented in Cork, actually, in UCC. Some of you might have heard of it. It goes under Alflorex. So that particular probiotic, they have one particularly that targets the gut-brain axis. I think it's called Zenflora or Zenflorex. I could be absolutely butchering this, but basically, it's feeding the gut particular gut bacteria that have been shown to have a positive correlative effect on people's moods. So it's absolutely brilliant. Righto, cultivating healthy habits through mindful eating. I love habits. I'm like a nun. Cultivating healthy habits through mindful eating would be it'd be very similar to shaping clay. So with a degree of going back to it all the time, we can mold our particular behaviors into the forms that we want them to take. So when we take the transformative power that can result in habit shifts to our eating patterns, we can see massive positive influences. Um, I'm throwing in studies now to beat the band. So there's another study, called the Cue Routine Reward Framework. It's by Charles Duhigg. This particular cycle elucidates that particular cues initiate a behavior. So triggers, routines, which then yield positive rewards or positive outcomes of behavior. When we become conscious of the particular triggers, and that could be um, being in the office. Being in the office is a huge one because lots of people come back to me and say, I've been really, really trying my best with my food habits. I'm doing my meal plan. I'm doing my shopping list. When I'm at home, I'm totally on top of things. But as soon as I go into the office, it seems to be somebody's birthday every day of the week. Or otherwise, it's like Cupcake Tuesday, Pizza Thursday. So the office can become a particular trigger because there's a lot more visual triggers that can then elicit a particular behavior, which elicit a particular outcome. So that's what's meant by those particular steps is wherever we are, the context and the environment primes us towards particular cues of behavior, and then we get a particular outcome from it. So if you kind of think of yourself as mindfulness is very often what's the word, associated with gardening. That's with regards to like what you place into your mind. So each meal becomes an opportunity to plant seeds of mindfulness, intention, and appreciation. It's not just enough to plant seeds, basically, is what I'm getting at. Like you have to tend to them, you have to water them, you have to give particular environments where things can thrive. In the same way as eating habits, just deciding, even though that is a pivotal and crucial step, just planting the seeds, so to speak, isn't enough. The environment and the context have to be favorable for that to progress in the way that you want it to. Now, you might say, Chloe, I have to go to the office. I can't just say, oh, well, Chloe said I can't be at the office just because it's not a good environment for my mental or mindful plants. What I mean by that is until the point that you are in a position where you feel confident that you can be in specific environments, you might decide that particular lunchtimes or cake cutting activities is the time that you politely excuse yourself after saying happy birthday, but go, look, I'm going to go just for a quick walk around the place. And be gentle with yourself and don't expect yourself to be like absolutely on point with this as soon as you begin, especially if there's an awful lot of triggers thrown at you. Gently ease yourself into things. See that you can do it in small amounts incrementally, and then it becomes easier to just be in that space, knowing that you are totally able to be in a particular space like that. And lastly, let's have a quick look at impact of mindful eating on overall well-being. As I said, guys, if you've any comments at any point, just pop them in to the chat. So obviously eating is something that we have to do. And it is not just food for fuel. And I think adopting that as a kind of mantra can be good when you're overcoming, you're beginning obstacles with things. But it is also tied to your mood. It's tied to how you, the enjoyment of a particular activity, the enjoyment of a particular part of the day. And although I would greatly advocate to think of the aspect of food for fuel insofar as make sure that what you're having adequately fuels you, I don't think it should be stripped away of all of the positive mental aspects that it can bring, all of the positive kind of associations that you can have. I think food is really interlaced in our culture as a celebration. And although the celebration food items that we choose should be fuel, that's good quality fuel for our body, it should also be enjoyable. And what I will say to people with regards enjoyment and mindfulness of food, firstly, if you employ the practice of mindful eating, it enhances cognitive function, it uplifts moods, and you have a greater sense of emotional well-being. So already, just by trying to appreciate the flavors, just by trying to appreciate textures, how things smell, how they look even on the plate, is a huge, it can really, really benefit your overall well-being, your overall enjoyment, and release those nice endorphins. So although I would agree that it needs to be good fuel, it doesn't mean that it needs to be absolutely boring gruel like they have in the Matrix. Like, that is food, that's fuel in the Matrix. But do I want to have a bowl of gruel every day? No, I don't actually. So trying to find the enjoyment in foods that are good for you. And the enemy of this actually, those of you with either yourself in those that have done kind of bodybuilding, or if you've people in your life that have exceedingly strict food diets, unless you're absolutely capable of trying on that hat of food for fuel, and that's just it, having things like chicken and broccoli, for example, every single day, um, it tends to push people into this kind of all or nothing approach to food, that they're very, 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 very on it until they go, I absolutely can't do this anymore. And they swing right back to the other side of what they deem to be joyful eating, or food with a bit of soul, or food that brings them enjoyment. And oftentimes, when you haven't built the association to make healthy foods enjoyable, there tends to be a kind of bifurcation where you think of chicken and broccoli every day for your lunch as healthy food equals misery. Or otherwise, you have pizza, ice cream, and chips. That's the happy food. So you've not created a kind of in between where those things can kind of come together, where you have a more holistic approach to your enjoyment of food, how it's going to help your gut. And the other thing that I'd say on that actually is, when we chew our food mindfully, not it's aside from the kind of psychological factors, for those of you that suffer with gastrointestinal difficulties, bloating, gas, cramps, those types of difficulties, the more we chew, so the longer we stay on this side of our bodies while we're eating. So we're chewing, we're chewing, we're chewing, we're kind of thinking, oh, what does it remind me of, this and that and the other thing. What you're doing on a mechanical basis here is you're triggering your body to start to release digestive enzymes. So the more you mechanically chew, the more your body gets the signal to release digestive enzymes. And what those are is, they're enzymes that you release in your stomach so that when the food comes down, it helps to break it down. So if you just go from here right down to the belly in the kind of, I'll say I have those days, like I call it shovel days, where I'm just in it goes. You've not given yourself the time to actually produce the digestive enzymes. So when the food goes down, it's a lot more difficult for your gut to actually break down the foods. And that can show itself in, as I said, gas, because it's not been broken down and it's missing all these different things. Fullness, bloating, cramping. So from even a mechanical perspective, it's a really, really good idea to stay up in the mindful space for a little while longer, and you're going to see that run through much, much better. So to kind of summarize all the different bits and bobs, there's a huge aspect to mindful eating that will help us to actually enjoy our food better, to have elevated levels of endorphins. And why shouldn't we enjoy things better? Why shouldn't we have a better experience of things? It can help us to function a little bit better with regards to that brain gut axis. Our moods can be better, our experience of our foods can be better, or biomechanical digestion can be better, and it will allow us to create associations with health foods, foods that positively fuel our bodies, as more pleasurable. And when something is more pleasurable, it becomes a lot easier to sustain long term. And I'm a massive advocate for, is this way of eating sustainable? That's a question I get an awful lot. And that's a, how long is a piece of string? If we come at it from the ways of being compassionate, gentle, and allowing ourselves to enjoy these things, yes, it's absolutely sustainable. If we do, I'm picking on chicken and broccoli. I mean, there's nothing wrong with chicken and broccoli. But if we do that every single day for 3 months, I do not believe that that is sustainable long term. So that's me. That's a little bit on mindful eating. Have some fun today with, I don't know, finding a quiet spot and trying to sit into your body as much as possible. Give yourself as much information. And that's the key here with mindful eating. You're looking for as much sensory information as you can about something, and you will see your enjoyment levels of that will massively rise. So that's me for today on mindful eating. I'll be back next week looking at overcoming procrastination. So for those of you that suffer with challenges around procrastination, I'll just give a few little tips and tricks. That's me for today, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your weekend. Thanks a million, Mike Lindsay. Thanks, Chloe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time, guys. No, so my banners are very slow today. Or rather, I'm very slow today.